Have you ever had someone tell you a story that you swear you already knew, but as you start to listen, there are details you aren't familiar with? Parts of the story that whoever told it before didn't think were important, or simply didn't know about themselves. And as you listen to these details, you get sucked back into the story, listening to it like it's your first time, wondering what new info will be relayed to you next. That's the feeling I get every time whiskey history brings me back to the start of my home country. The same feeling I hope to share with you now as we uncover the whiskey history of early America and its ties to a founding father. Behind every bottle is hundreds of stories, every step starting from growing grain until it reaches your glass. This spirit is collecting experiences and stories that I would love to tell you. It's my goal to sift through these stories, find the most meaningful, and bring them forward to your attention. This isn't another whiskey review channel or show. This is pure storytelling. I won't analyze every detailed tasting note of the spirit in the bottle. Instead, I'll dive into the details of the spirit behind the bottle. And this is the spirit of Washington. This whiskey-related history actually starts out with a different drink entirely, rum. In the 16 and 1700s, the colony's drink of choice was rum. It was considered safer to drink than water, kept better than beer, and was even treated as currency at times. The sugarcane plantations of the British West Indies were close at hand and had plenty of molasses as a byproduct of their sugar production. This was traded to the American colonies for cheap as it was a waste product, and then they turned it into rum. But on July 4th, 1776, a national treasure was ratified, the Declaration of Independence. This, of course, would launch the colonies into war against the British, who in turn cut off trade to America from the West Indies, effectively eliminating the supply of molasses. This lack of raw material and a rise in nationalism called for a new drink, something that could be made without the need of the British. That is where whiskey entered. When the early colonists made the journey to the New World, many were unsure what waited for them and what would grow in their new home. So many took with them seeds to grow rye, since that was a more hardy grain that can grow in hard, rocky soil. Due to this, rye was a more prevalent grain in the colonies, especially popular in Pennsylvania, so rye whiskey became the natural substitution. In 1775, Congress placed George Washington in charge of the Continental Army. He had a background in military leadership, having served in the French and Indian War where, in one battle, while trying to rally his troops, he had 2 horses shot out from under him, and 4 bullet holes pierced his coat, but his bravery didn't falter, which earned him the full leadership of Virginia's military. This experience against overwhelming odds would somewhat prepare him for taking on the British. He would write home to his wife, Martha, that he expected to be home to their estate at Mount Vernon in the fall, not knowing that the battle would keep him away from his peaceful life at home for 8 years. As impressive as his past career had been, practically, the new general was not ready to be hastily thrown into full command of the revolutionists. Washington was forced to have to learn as he went. General Washington had the mental and emotional fortitude to look at failures and pitfalls and see how he can improve his leadership and command for the next battle, rather than crumbling under the stress. He was up against the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent overseas, which, apart from being substantially bigger, was better equipped and trained than Washington's men. But Washington was daring, using tactics that the opposition never suspected, such as crossing the Delaware on Christmas night. He knew it was more important to be flexible. He he would rather give up land than lose troops, take cities where he could to keep public support, and not fight in an open field. During the war, Congress voted to supply the Continental Army with beer, but as beer doesn't travel or keep as well as liquor, General George Washington pushed for whiskey. Under Washington's directions, each soldier was given a gill, or 4 ounces, of whiskey per day, and could be awarded more whiskey for acts of valor by their commanders. Washington even asked Congress to fund the creation of new distilleries to help produce the necessary quantity of whiskey for the soldiers, which they refused. The directive to give a gill of whiskey per day to every soldier would stand for the next 50 years. But for the revolutionists, it helped to galvanize the soldiers, kept them warm during the cold winter in Valley Forge, and helped America win its first war, which I imagine was celebrated with a drink. The American people regarded Washington with so much reverence that he could have been king. In fact, multiple unconfirmed stories say that the public asked him to be. But instead, he resigned, wanting not to serve the public again and enjoy a quiet and peaceful life in Mount Vernon, which would not last long and instead made him even more of a sensation. From his home at Mount Vernon, Washington watched as Congress tried to create a functional government, and he was disappointed by what he saw. A government that could not collect revenue or pay off its debts. He wrote to James Madison and said what was needed was a constitution. And if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. So Washington went to Philadelphia for a convention, where he was unanimously chosen to preside over the convention, which would take months. During this time, he spoke very little, but when he did, it was with authority and passion for wanting what was truly best for the new government and the country to survive. After the Constitution was approved, he once again wished to retire to that nice, peaceful life at Mount Vernon, which again did not last long. When the first presidential election was held, he received a vote from every single elector, making him the only unanimous president. As the new country and its government emerged from the war, General Washington became President Washington. One of the first problems facing the new government was the national debt from the war. Alexander Hamilton proposed a solution: taxes, specifically on whiskey distilleries. The country's first tax was placed on the production capacity of a still, which means the tax collector would assume you were running your still at max capacity 24/7. At this time, most farmers had a still so that if their crop was going to go bad, they could quickly distill it into a lasting product rather than lose the potential revenue. These stills were used sparingly, but the farmers were now taxed as if they were a full-time distillery. The other large problem with this tax was the farmers didn't exactly have any representation in the new government. But for the most part, Washington found that most states were in favor of the new government and would continue to support it. He felt like he was no longer needed and planned on stepping down after his first term to try and enjoy the peaceful life that was waiting for him at Mount Vernon. But again, he was begged to continue his service with a second term in office. Back to whiskey taxes. Taxation without representation was already a sore subject in the former colonies. So, unsurprisingly, the farmers decided to make the same choice once again and start a rebellion. In Pennsylvania, the Whiskey Rebellion was formed. In July of 1794, nearly 400 rebels burned down the home of the regional tax collector. This was the first threat to national security faced by the country. Washington called upon the states to form a militia. This is the first time the government would call for troops since the Revolutionary War. No one knew how many, or if any, would answer the call. But when he rode to retake the town of Pittsburgh, he had roughly 13,000 men behind him. A much smaller rebellion quickly dispersed, with only 2 being brought to trial, which Washington, recognizing the civil unrest within the country regarding the unfair tax and not wanting to give the rebellion martyrs, pardoned both of them. Washington's second term ended, and he finally was able to retire. But his relation with whiskey didn't stop at politics. In fact, his nice, peaceful home in Mount Vernon was now home to a shining copper still. His farm manager, James Anderson, was originally from Scotland, and in October 1776, he proposed to Washington that they set up a distillery on the grounds. Washington apparently liked this idea because it was soon home to not just 1, but 5 stills, and was operational by the spring of 1778. The distillery produced 11,000 gallons of whiskey per year at its height, and sold to neighbors, merchants, family members, and the workers at Mount Vernon. Of all the ways that Washington diversified the income of Mount Vernon, whiskey would be his most profitable. Even after he eventually passed away, the farm manager Anderson kept the distillery operational. And that's where this story ends. I hope you enjoyed this look back at American history with a focus on whiskey. If you like the idea of drinking George Washington's rye whiskey, the distillery is actually still in operation today in Mount Vernon. And, even more impressive, the workers dress in period clothing while using direct fire to heat the still. They produce rye whiskey with the same mash bill that was originally used and enjoyed by the first president. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to be the first to know when the next episode comes out, join my mailing list. I'll have it linked in the show description. For now, I think I'm going to enjoy a glass of rye myself. Next time on The Spirit of, we follow the escapades of a personal hero of mine, a man whose strategies to get sales are so clever they sound like fiction, and how he became a baron of whiskey. I'll see you there.